Welcome to Reform Thinking. So today we're going to talk about a man whose hymns have given comfort to, well, millions of people. But his own life was marked by just this constant, crushing despair. We're talking about William Cowper. I'm sure a lot of you have sung these exact words. William Cowper was without a doubt one of the most beloved hymn writers of the 18th century. I mean, his words have been a source of real comfort for believers for ages. But the man who penned these lines about trusting God, his own life was anything but peaceful.
You know, that one stanza, it just perfectly captures this whole theology of trusting in God's goodness, even when we can't see it, especially in the tough times. But, and this is the hard part, the man who wrote this was fighting a paralyzing depression for his entire life, and even tried to kill himself several times.
So right away, you see the massive paradox of his life. How could a man write with such deep trust in God's sovereignty, while at the same time, personally, he was living under this constant dark cloud of spiritual hopelessness?
Yeah, so how do we even begin to square the faith that we read in his hymns with the awful despair we see in his life? To get a handle on that, we really have to go all the way back to the beginning.
Cowper's struggles really started with just a whole series of devastating things in his childhood. His mom died when he was only 6, then he gets shipped off to this awful boarding school where he's bullied relentlessly. And then, get this, when he's 11, his own father asks him to read and give his opinion on a paper defending suicide. Just wow. And then the final straw seems to be when he's forbidden to marry his cousin, Theodora, after they'd been engaged for 7 years.
I mean, every single one of these things just piled on top of the others, making his feeling of being abandoned just worse and worse. And when you read this poem later in his life, you realize he isn't just making a point about public schools. It's a gut-wrenching cry for the kind of fatherly protection that he felt like he never, ever got. So all this deep anxiety, it just kept building until it all came to a head in 1763. He was up for a government job, but there was a public examination he had to go through, and the thought of it just completely broke him.
He made several attempts on his own life and was finally committed to the St. Albans Insane Asylum. But it was right there, in what seems like the most hopeless place imaginable, that God met him.
The guy in charge, Dr. Cotton, was a Christian, and under his care, Cowper had this very clear conversion experience. First, he was just flattened by the guilt of his sin, especially his suicide attempts. Then, he's reading John 11 and is just blown away by the mercy and goodness of Christ. And then the final piece fell into place when he read Romans 3:25 and it clicked. He finally understood that Christ's death was the propitiation, the thing that satisfied God's wrath against sin for anyone who believes.
And in that moment, he says he felt this strength to believe and was just overwhelmed with love and wonder. But here's the thing, and it's so key. His conversion, as real as it was, didn't make his depression just vanish. And that tension is what you see playing out for the rest of his life and in his work.
Now, this is where a really big figure comes into the picture. John Newton, the guy who wrote Amazing Grace. Newton became Cowper's pastor, and more than that, his friend. And Newton, seeing both Cowper's incredible poetic gift and his crippling depression, had an idea. He said, hey, let's write a hymn book together for our church. And that project became the famous Olney Hymns. It was a way to give Cowper's gifts an outlet.
Newton was a faithful friend through all of Cowper's later breakdowns, but that internal war just kept raging. And you can see this split-screen view of his soul perfectly in 2 things he wrote in the very same year. In a private letter, he sounds totally hopeless, writing, "A soul once slain lives no more." But then, in his public poem, The Task, he talks about Christ finding him like a wounded deer, pulling out the arrows, healing him, and telling him to live. And this conflict, it really did continue right to the very end. His last original poem is called The Castaway, and it's this incredibly bleak story about a sailor who gets washed overboard and is just left to die. Cowper says that sailor's story is his story, that he's been swallowed by deeper gulfs than he. It really seems like he died believing that God had forsaken him.
Man, that's just a hard story. So what on earth can we learn from a life that seems so bleak? Well, actually, there's quite a bit. His struggles have some really practical lessons for us today. First thing is this: we have to learn to distrust the certainties of despair. Despair lies. It tells you that this is it, it's over, and there's no hope. But even in Cowper's own writings, his certainty of being damned wasn't so certain, because he'd turn around and write poems filled with hope in Christ.
Second, and this one is huge, love your children. Love them dearly. So much of Cowper's lifelong sorrow seems to trace right back to the loss of his mother and the absence of his father. It's just a tragic picture of how much a child needs that parental presence.
Third takeaway: don't give up on people who are in despair. Think about John Newton. His steady, patient, consistent friendship with Cowper is such a great model for how we should care for people who are really suffering. And finally, number 4, never ever stop telling discouraged people the good news of the gospel, because at the end of the day, it was the raw mercy of Jesus and the truth that his death was enough to cover sin that broke through to Cowper when he was at his absolute lowest.
We have to keep pointing people to those truths again and again, even when it feels like they can't hear it. Because in God's sovereign plan, even a story of incredible suffering like William Cowper's can become a means of grace, a strange kind of encouragement, and a reason for us to hope in the one who promises to hold us fast all the way to the end.